So, ladies and gentlemen, I have with me Dr. Budzisz. He's a professor of political science and constitutional law at Loras College. I'd like to thank him for joining me today and addressing some of these complicated circumstances in which we find ourselves. Um, Thank you for joining me.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure as well. So this is a bit of an unusual set of circumstances, as you've commented before in your lectures and your commentaries. In particular, it seems unprecedented that we have a president being charged specifically with insurrection of all things, or specifically the incitement of an insurrection. That would be pretty extreme, to put it lightly, right?
Right. In the article of impeachment that's in front of the House currently, it's incitement to violence, right? And incitement to violence as it relates to the counting of the Electoral College and the results of the 2020 election. So the articles of impeachment that have been provided by the House discuss this incitement as a violation of his oath of office and as counting as a high crime or misdemeanor, to use the language of the Constitution. And it is surrounding this event, but it also predates the event. It deals with President Trump's attempts to influence the Georgia Secretary of State to find votes and the kind of undermining of public confidence in the election results.
So
But
yeah,
the incitement is certainly the key part to it.
yeah, and like in addition to that, it seems interesting that not only was there a tape for them to sort of use to address a pattern of behavior, um, it seems to me that there is. Oh, I'm gonna just the notifications keep coming up, and I'm gonna mute them. There we go. I apologize for that. I'm
No
just
worries.
turn that off. Anyway, so there seems to be a pattern of behavior that they're trying to establish with the basically the accusations against him. They're trying to make it very clear that his motivations are consistently against the Constitution, but also the election specifically. And I wonder if that further bolsters their case or ends up making it a bit more of a political issue, because many people among the Republican Party, although not as many as say with the Ukraine deal, were not as willing to like denounce it as one would expect. But in this case, they call it the Georgia Secretary of State.
Right, right. I do think that these additional, I think the House is in a position where they're trying to establish that it's not simply one event; it's a pattern, right?
Mm.
It's consistent with prior efforts that the president has made. Because I think one of the things that they're trying to tap into is the underlying logic behind impeachment. So I think that's where it's important to turn to things like Federal 65 with Alexander Hamilton, where he's describing in particular, the Senate's role of impeachment, but he's describing their impeachment in general and what's involved in impeachment. And in fact, what he says is that this is inherently a political process, right? So we can't think of impeachment as somehow apolitical. It is always, in some sense, a political process, but that's different than saying it's partisan, right? So a political process is one in which the political branches are responsible. In this case, elected officials in the United States House, the United States Senate. But the problem becomes when it's partisan. And Hamilton in 65 notes that. He says it is by definition going to be a political process. And unfortunately, sometimes it will be more of a reflection of factions or which party has the greatest advantage, and isn't about guilt or innocence. And so he knows that. Hamilton knows that and is concerned with that. But Hamilton, in that same, I think it's the second or third paragraph in Federal 65, explains that ultimately what impeachment is about those moments in which people of high office, presidents, cabinet members, government officials, have violated their oath of office. And ultimately, the victims involved in impeachment is society itself. It's the public, right? And so what you have to ask yourself is, when you look at this particular impeachment, is what the House presents a reflection on the president's actions leading to society being harmed, whether it's the faith in democracy, the trust in democracy, nonviolent expression, right? Those things, or violence in the Capitol, the death of individuals, police officer, in addition to insurrectionists, right? A storming of the Capitol. Do those things actually involve harm to the public in its broadest and biggest sense? And that's the very kind of thing that Hamilton was speaking about. And so I think that that's one reason why you see the articles of impeachment written the way they did write these, is to try to speak, I think, to that notion that there's a fundamental violation of public trust, and ultimately an undermining of the Constitution and the rule of law, and that ultimately the victim here is society and the public at large, which is ultimately what you see there in 65.
What's interesting about Hamilton's view on it, when he addresses factionalism, he points to the Senate as the one that's going to be the most protected against factionalism. But some Americans, including myself, would argue that the Senate is the one that's currently the most likely to let their partisan ideology, their partisan perspective, guide them in possibly, once again, not impeaching and convicting the man. Well, technically, impeachment is in the House, but you get what I'm saying.
Right.
So the question becomes, what about the Senate allows it to become arguably corrupted by its partisan impulses in the same way that we might expect from the House?
Yeah, I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that Hamilton was writing in a time in which the selection of the senators came from the state, right? He's writing before we have popular election of senators. And that's a major change in the way we conduct our democratic affairs here, small d democratic affairs here in the United States. And I think that needs to be remembered, is that previously it would be state legislatures choosing who the senators were. So I guess I would say that I don't necessarily see the Senate as being more partisan. I think one of the things that you can kind of point to is that it requires a higher threshold, right? So it's a 2/3. So ultimately, one of the things that's so difficult is finding, enough senators to get to 2/3. So that is a problem, or a limitation. So, but to put it in perspective, Connor, when the president was impeached the first time, there were no votes of Republicans to support the articles of impeachment in the House, and there was a vote in the Senate to convict him by a Republican. So if you want to think just in the first time Trump was impeached, no Republicans in the House broke party ranks. One Republican broke ranks in the Senate. This time around, I don't know if the number will hit a dozen, but there's at least 5 or 6 currently who say they're going to vote for impeachment, and there may be a few more. But let's say there's 10 this time, or let's just say there's 5. That's more than last time. And in the Senate, it certainly appears that you're going to have more this time as well than you did last time. There's something very, very different about this impeachment than the previous, and I think. And I think that shows up in the actions of individual members. And if you look at the way the discussion's unfolding in American politics right now, there's very little discussion, even amongst Republicans, that speak to the actions themselves of the president or speak to the day, but rather it's about the potential divisiveness of an impeachment process, or it's about the rushed nature of it, or the process involved. It's process-based arguments, or it's about consequence-based arguments that have nothing to do directly with whether or not the actions of the moment warrant impeachment. Right? And that's one of the really curious things here, because if you go back to the first impeachment, there were conversations in public, whether or not in good faith or not, that said what the president said here does not amount to a high crime or misdemeanor. It does not amount to an impeachable offense. Versus this cycle, which senators tend to be talking about how divisive this will be, and how it will wreck unity, and how it places people in danger and will only inflame passions even more. So in one sense, it isn't, there isn't a defense being made. It is an attempt to undermine the House procedure and the Senate procedure based upon arguments that have nothing to do directly with the substance of the charges, but more about the procedure and process.
Yeah, and that leads into my next question regarding, well, the co-opting of the message of the incoming Biden administration. A lot of times, the argument that I've heard so far is this is going to divide the country even more. Good luck unifying people when you've just impeached the last president. My question for you is, how does a country recover and unify after an attempted insurrection without consequences for those involved in the insurrection?
It's a good question. I think there's a couple ways to get at it. One is, I don't think this will be consequence free for the insurrectionists. So that's one thing, is that the public may start thinking, once, however impeachment ends, let's just kind of fast forward a few months, there is no doubt that there will probably in the end be hundreds of people charged with crimes as it relates to January 6th, right? Or the planning beforehand, or things that happen afterwards. So there's no doubt that there will be a judicial process for those who actually storm the Capitol. And some of them will face significant jail time, right? And time in prison.
Hopefully.
So I think that's one thing to note, is that there are arrests. There certainly will be more arrests. And while there's been silence in one sense publicly about the Department of Justice and the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office about what's happening blow by blow, it's pretty clear that there is a significant law enforcement operation in place and underway to address the insurrectionists. So that's one way to look at the answer, is how do we move on? How do we if there aren't consequences? Well, one thing I think is there will be strong consequences, or at least I hope there are, for large swaths of individuals who are directly involved with the actual storming of the Capitol. That doesn't answer the kind of implication of your question, which is, what about those people maybe in high office, like a president, like President Trump, who may have a role in this to play as well? If there isn't impeachment, if there isn't a conviction, it certainly appears that that there wasn't a strong consequence than a lot of people expect there should be. And I think that's a problem. I do also think on that side, the impeachment is not going to be the sole mechanism. I think what you're also going to see very likely is an extended effort, and I would hope it would be bipartisan as much as possible, especially on the Senate side, for a thorough investigation of the timeline, consequence, actors, people involved.
Mm.
So I think, to answer your question about how do you move forward in the rest, in political science research, there's a heavy, in literature, there's a heavy dose of this idea of truth and reconciliation as a mechanism for overcoming kind of traumatic events that kind of shake the foundation of a political system.
Mm.
In some cases, it never happens. And what ends up happening in those situations is that the underlying causes and the underlying bad actors really are never addressed. And then guess what? A few years later, things rise up again and it's a problem. But we have instances, whether it's in Europe or it's in South Africa after the end of apartheid, in which you do have clarity and investigations that are seen as fair and nonpartisan, that say, okay, here's what happened in full detail, right? Or as in full a detail as we can provide. Those type of events and those type of processes can be very helpful to try to have societies move forward as well. Now, as I'm sitting here right now, it's incredibly difficult to think that we're going to have a bipartisan or nonpartisan examination of what happened for a kind of fact record, for creation of the record. But that would be something that could happen as well. So if impeachment ultimately, the House will impeach. Whether the Senate convicts is a different matter. If the Senate does not convict, for many people, that will be a lost opportunity. And they will say, we did not stand up, and the country did not stand up to say something was wrong. Fortunately, between the arrests of the actual individuals and the rooting out of these networks, along with potentially the political branches leading a thorough and public investigation of what took place, perhaps we can overcome that shortcoming if there isn't a conviction. Otherwise, it becomes, I think you've pointed out a real problem about how do you move forward with something like this.
Yeah, and it kind of touches on something similar to what Mitt Romney said when during the certification process, if you want the country to reconcile, tell them the truth, sort of thing. But on another note, you along with about 1,000 political scientists were part of a letter signing that was basically calling for the removal of President Trump from office, whether that be by the 25th Amendment or by impeachment. Now that Mike Pence is no longer willing to invoke the 25th, what are some of the reasons you think impeachment are not only beneficial to society, but the reasons you decided as a political scientist to sign that letter?
Right. And as you know, I try very, very hard to keep my own views of things at bay. I take it kind of as a point of pride that students don't necessarily know what the heck I think or what my partisan leanings or affiliations are, because I don't want it to be part of the classroom, and it shouldn't be part of the classroom. And so I had a, I don't know, maybe, I did a little back and forth in my mind about, okay, do I sign something like this? When I first saw it come out, it was led by a couple of prominent political scientists at Dartmouth and a couple of other institutions. And it was an open letter by political scientists basically saying, that we believe that the president has violated his oath of office. And because of this, we call upon either the removal via the 25th or the impeachment. So as a first matter, I generally don't sign on to things, and I don't, partly because the main reason is I don't really see it as my place to express my own personal views. I think it can get in the way sometimes, or at least in the way you're perceived. I don't want students to think that when we're examining something in class that I'm coming from it from a partisan perspective or an ideological perspective that I'm trying to convince them of. It's not, I don't think that's a healthy classroom. But I signed this letter, I think, because when I read Federalist 65 and I think about what the fundamental obligations of office are, call me crazy, but I think one of the fundamental obligations of taking an oath to the Constitution is that you don't try to subvert the Constitution, which is exactly what I see has happened here. I believe the president's, through his words, actions, beliefs, fomented. He held a rally. You got to ask yourself, if you don't have removal from office or impeachment proceedings based upon a president of the United States claiming even before the election took place that the election is going to be stolen if he loses, he won't necessarily accept if he loses, will he commit to a peaceful transition of power? He was being asked that question last year, and he was refusing to answer those kind of questions. And then to go on an unfounded crusade of sorts to rally people to see that an election was stolen. And then, and this is the key part in my mind, take the critical step to try to subvert the constitutional process for the transfer of power. It's one thing to go around and say, I think we got robbed. It's one thing to go to courts and say, I challenge these ballots or that ballots, right? That's one thing. And you have the right to litigate these things, and you should if you believe that you're wronged. But once you lose these cases, and once it's clear that what you're saying is actually not connected to reality, you are in essence duping and trying to manipulate the public. And you're doing so, at least from my perspective, in a way to undermine and subvert democracy and subvert the Constitution. So it's when the president pushes Mike Pence publicly, privately, when he calls the Secretary of State. And, if you think about this, how many calls do we not necessarily know? We know some of these calls, and they're designed to place undue pressure on elected officials to change the election result. The rally, the march to Washington, the whole thing, to stand up, to fight, to not be cowards, to be patriots, is intended to thwart, to slow, to obstruct the constitutional process. That is an undermining of the Constitution, and that, to me, is a direct violation of the oath of office. And then when you see during the storming of the Capitol, and people are in lockdown, and the vice president's being threatened, and there's chance of hanging Mike Pence outside, the president is saying on Twitter, "We love you." Ivanka Trump saying, "You're patriots. Remember this day. This is what happens when people steal an election from you." So he's perpetuating this even during it, and is refusing to say, "Get the hell out of the Capitol now. I'm immediately calling this, this, and this. Stand down. I was wrong. I never intended for you to do any of this. This was wrong. I used rhetoric that I should not have," right? There is zero accountability here. And I think that the proper mechanism, the constitutional mechanism, is what Hamilton lays out in Federalist 65. For the reason he lays it out is that the victim here is the public. Belief in the government, the following of the Constitution, and it is a violation of that public trust that Hamilton talks about. So for me, it was an easy letter to sign eventually once I watch what's happening, because I'm reading Alexander Hamilton and I'm looking at the founding arguments, and I'm thinking about what the future holds if you don't bring charges forward or remove from office. So for me, it was a constitutional argument. It was one that I signed because I think the constitutional processes exist for the president to be removed, and there were grounds to remove him. And it's not something I take lightly. It's a horrible thing. I don't want to make a public statement that president should be impeached, or the 25th. I don't want to be in this kind of position to make that to be brought to this moment. But I also don't think it helps anybody to avoid looking at what the founders said, looking at what the Constitution says, and looking at the actions, because that's a responsibility of citizens too. So.
Yeah, and I just from my own personal experience, when I was live streaming some of these attacks on our Capitol building, it was disturbing because there were people who were at the Capitol making comments in the live streams, and you could hear them saying things like, "I want a piece of Pelosi's hair," or things like that, clear threats. And so I guess my question, I guess for really all of America, but also you, is when you hear people say things like, "Oh, he didn't overtly say take the Capitol," how do we respond to those kind of arguments when it's pretty clear what his intention was and how reckless he was when he was dealing with this?
Right. One thing is, it's not simply the magic words, "Go storm the Capitol and kill a police officer." The way the language of impeachment works, and the way that Hamilton speaks about it, it is this kind of violation of public trust here, and this notion that they've subverted the Constitution. So harming society by knowingly sowing discord, right? By knowingly sowing critical doubt, by encouraging, even if it's not specific act, but encouraging a position or view that fundamentally undermines the Constitution, and trying to influence a constitutional process. Like, that's what's most important here. Yeah, there were no magic words saying, "Here's exactly what I want you to do." But remember, impeachment's not a process that is the same as a court of law, right? It's a political process. We have to try our best to not make it a partisan process. And I think that's really the key distinction, is that it is a political process. So the standards for evidence or what somebody would have to do to demonstrate incitement isn't the same as you would expect if he was being prosecuted in a federal court or something.
Mm.
So I think that's one of the ways to respond to those things, is that those specific words, you're right, might not have been uttered, but what does the pattern reveal about the actions of the office holder? And I think all you have to do is read some of the statements of the Republicans who have supported impeachment, um, and others. For instance, I mean, Liz Cheney was very clear in her statement yesterday, and as was Adam Kinzinger and a couple of others, about how they see events. So I think to respond to that that's true. Those specific words weren't uttered. You have to look at the pattern, and you have to also remember that when we have conversations about what evidence exists, don't think of it as evidence as it relates to something like a court of law. It's a political process where we're asking, in essence, has this person undermined or damaged the constitutional order? And I think the president would be in much less trouble, frankly, if he would, as it was occurring, have responded in real time in a way that didn't encourage more of it and didn't continue to imperil the institution. As Mike Pence is huddled away in a secure location with Secret Service, the president's tweeting about how bad Mike Pence is. That doesn't seem to be the actions of a person who is contrite, or a person who has said, okay, wait a second, I didn't mean it this way, people. I didn't mean for you to actually physically go do this. Don't take me literally, right? That whole literal serious thing that you hear with President Trump. So I think that's one way you respond to those people.
All right, now I'll try to wrap up a bit so I don't keep you too long. But I just have one final question. Where do you see the Republican Party going from this point? Let's impeachment or not, where do you think the Republican Party is going to go with its more moderate establishment leaders and its more radical pro-Trump base? Where do you think they can go in terms of their path back to power, as it relates to the institutions at large?
Right. That's really a big question. As it sits right now, I expect that the moderates in the party will continue to lose. I don't really see a path for moderates nationally. I do see a path for continued path for some in specific states or areas. But in terms of the national party drift, I think the national party drift won't moderate. I don't think it's going to suddenly swing back. I think, however, that the long-term prospects for the GOP will probably drift away from Trumpism, precisely because Trump will be out of office and become more marginalized. And his followers, because if you start looking at public opinion polls, one of the things that stands out is that there's an increasing number of people who identify as being supporters of Trump more than they do Republicans, right? And I think with most of those kind of movements, there's an energy across time that tends to dissipate, especially when that person is not in office and is not with direct kind of political power. And I think the president is in for a rocky road post-presidency. Legal jeopardy for actions at like state level, for instance, financial issues, all of those things are probably going to increase tension on him. So his ability to maintain that base will be a trouble. So I think Trumpism isn't going away in the next year or two. Members of Congress who kind of have that approach are going to continue to thrive. Moderates will kind of crash. But I expect in a longer term window, maybe 3, 4, 5 years we're talking about here, I think that a lot of the energy that you see here may tip back into apathy or disassociation with the political system, which is in itself a danger, right? In fact, it in some ways is a bigger danger. But in terms of your question was about the GOP, that base that he's energized could just as easily leave once we move further and further away from Trump being the, at the heart of Twitter and at the heart of, in the White House. So I think short term, Trumpism remains basically the overwhelming, overarching kind of force in the GOP. But I think that energy is probably likely to be dissipating in the longer term. And that's a real problem for the GOP if what it's used, that's been the key to its success. I saw a comment by a staffer for, I think it was for Mitch McConnell, who said, and I believe this was on the record, something to the effect of, Trump has a winning coalition if you could, have his issues and his dynamics, but not introduce all the downside to it, right? They used a different word, but nonetheless, it is a winning coalition. However, at the heart of it seems to be the president himself. And if he's gone, I don't know if the coalition actually holds for that long. I don't see a natural successor necessarily. I think it will be the force, but it seems to be a force that wants to connect itself to a person or to a cause.
Sort of like
So I think long term, the danger for the GOP is not simply that that'll become the rising dominant force, because I think it is right now the rising dominant force. I think the fear for the party is that it actually erodes and goes back to being apolitical or counter system, right? It won't feel a home in the party at all. It'll actually kind of go away again. It'll be disenchanted or disillusioned.
So yeah, it seems just to be, not to be too hyperbolic, it almost seems like the Trumpism is a bit of a cult of personality, to some extent, because it's always connected to this one man. But I want to thank you for joining me and helping me out, trying to explain all of this craziness. And I look forward to discussing this with you further in person, or if possible, to have you back on the show at another time. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
No, thank you, Connor.